Hi, my name's Andy and you're watching Andy's Fire Club. So today we're going to talk about a topic that might hit a bit close to home for some of you. It's called broke is the new middle class. Now, when I was in high school, I used to think 100K a year was the biggest number in the world. So I used to think if I hit 100K a year, then I'll be set for the rest of my life. But as you can see, 100K a year isn't really a lot. And if you make 100K a year, it doesn't go as far as it used to. So let's make some assumptions here. I've devised a scenario where you're the sole breadwinner of your family, assuming that you have a family of 4, so you have a spouse and 2 kids. So if you make 100K a year in Ontario, you're only gonna be able to take home about 73K per year. Now, I know some of you will complain and say that you live in a place where the tax rate isn't as high as Ontario. And that might be true, but this is a scenario that I've devised in my current situation. Now, you might pay lower taxes on your income in other places, but you're also maybe stuck with things like health insurance, which I know for a lot of our American viewers, that's a thing that they need to pay for, especially if you have a family. But here in Canada, we have universal healthcare, so we don't have to pay for health insurance. So these numbers can vary depending from place to place. I'm just taking an example from a scenario that I know very well. So as I was saying, you make 73K a year after taxes. Now, if you do the math, that's about $6,100 per month. Which sounds like a lot, but as you will soon see, it's not. It doesn't go very far. So the first thing that people spend the most amount of money on is their rent or mortgage. Now, I've assumed that you spend $3,000 a month on your rent or mortgage. Now, this might seem a bit too much at first, but if you consider here in Ontario, so I live in the suburbs of Toronto, and a house that's 3,000 square foot in the suburbs of Toronto can easily go for $3,000 a month in terms of rent or mortgage. Now, I know some of my friends that are paying this number right now. In fact, one of my friends, he was just looking for an apartment in Toronto, and he was looking for just a 1-bedroom, and a lot of the choices were over $2,000 a month for rent just for a 1-bedroom apartment. So if you're looking for a house in, let's say, downtown Toronto or some other big city like Vancouver or Montreal, or if you live somewhere in America like New York or San Francisco, I can easily see your rent or mortgage being $3,000 per month or more. So I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption to assume. Now, the next big expense is transportational costs. So I'm assuming that you have 2 cars. So most of my friends who live in the suburbs, they have 2 cars because one of them is a family SUV and the other one is a sedan, and the sedan is used for whoever needs to use that car to get to work, and the family SUV is for weekends and things like that. So between the 2 cars, you gotta pay for insurance, which is mandatory here in Ontario, and you gotta pay for gas. And if something breaks, you gotta fix it. You gotta pay for oil changes. So maintaining a car is really expensive, and you can easily spend $1,000 a month on your car expenses in total. So I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that you're spending $1,000 a month on 2 cars, especially if you're one of those guys that like to spend money on that fancy BMW or the fancy Mercedes. So those cars are really expensive. They look really nice, but they're expensive to maintain. So the next thing that I assumed was $1,000 a month on your groceries and utilities. Now, I know this will vary from person to person, and it depends on where you shop. So if you shop at Costco or if you shop at a fancy Italian grocery store. So I know some of my friends who like to go to this fancy Italian grocery store chain here in Ontario called Longo's. So Longo's is known for having a lot of fancy food and a lot of Italian themed items, and their prices tend to be a little higher. So if you go to Longo's and buy all your food there, as opposed to going to like a Costco or even some discount grocery chains, then you'll spend a lot more there at Longo's versus the discount ones. It's not unreasonable to assume that no matter where you go, to feed a family of 4 is not cheap. And I'm throwing utilities in there too, just for the heck of it. So those rates will obviously vary from place to place depending on where you live. But you need to eat, you need to keep the lights on, you need to have running water in your house. So you can't really avoid that, and spending $1,000 a month is not really unreasonable if you have a family of 4. Now, the next expense is things like luxuries, right? So sometimes you may want to go out and eat with your family. You may want to have a Netflix subscription. The kids might want Disney Plus. You may want to have all these things that don't really build up to your assets, so they don't give you anything. They don't really stay. Once you spend the money, it's gone. So there's services that you pay for, and then once you enjoy the services, they're gone. So these are things that cash that you sort of just burn, and it doesn't really go anywhere, and you just enjoy it. And now I'm not saying that you can't enjoy anything, and I'm not saying that you can't spend any money on luxuries, but keep in mind that this is money that you're just burning that is not going to go into investments, that's not going to benefit you in the future after you've enjoyed it. So if you're doing the math at home, you'll see that now you only have $600 left over. And now I made a footnote saying that for our folks in America, again, as I mentioned earlier, we have universal health care here in Canada. And for our folks there in America, they have to pay for health insurance. So I didn't put health insurance on there because it varies from place to place and it depends on who you are or even what country you're from. But if you have to pay for health insurance, that could easily be $600 a month for a family of 4, right? Or it could be even more. So that $600 that you have left over that you were going to invest in Tesla stock is gone. Now, also, I'm assuming that you don't have any credit card debt. Now, this might be overly generous because I know a lot of friends and family that are in credit card debt. Now, personally, the reason why I didn't leave it in is because we really can't say how much credit card debt the average person has because it varies drastically from person to person. So I don't think it was fair to sort of just put a random number in there and just say, oh, the average person has this amount of credit card debt. Like, for example, for me, I've always been really careful with credit cards. So I always pay my bills in full every month at the end of every month. And I never pay a dime of credit card interest. So I've never paid a dime for credit card interest in my entire life. So I believe that that's the proper way to use credit cards. But a lot of people that I know that are not as diligent as I am, they really struggle with this. So if you have a massive amount of credit card debt, that could easily be more than $600 a month just on the interest on your credit card, never mind how much you owe on the credit card in the first place. So again, I'm being very generous here. I'm not assuming that you have any credit card debt in this whole scenario. But if you do, again, that could easily be a negative number. So I don't mean to scare you, but it's not looking good. And you're probably at home sitting there, and let's say you don't even make $100K a year right now. And you're sitting and you're thinking, man, even if I make $100K a year, this is the situation that I'm gonna be stuck in. What do I do? What's the solution for this, right? Well, the solution is I gotta make more money, right? That's the first thing you think. If I make $200K a year, then all my problems will be solved, right? Well, wrong. Well, actually, you would be right, but again, it's not as easy as it seems, right? If you could easily snap your finger and turn $100K a year into $200K a year, then everybody would be doing it. So my point is that unless you get some like crazy promotion or some crazy bonus or some crazy raise, you're not going to be able to get from $100K a year to making $200K a year really fast, especially if you work at a 9-to-5 job, like an office job or something like that. So there's no way for you to really rapidly increase your income. But there is something that you can do right now is try and reduce some of your big expenses that I've labeled right here. Now, I know some of you might give me a little bit of hate for this, but I'm gonna say it anyways. Maybe one of the first things that you could look into is downsizing or reducing your rent or mortgage expense. So if you're spending $3,000 a month on rent or mortgage, then you might want to cut down upon that if you're only making around $6,000 a month. So if you're spending half of your income on just housing expense, that's a lot of money, especially if it's rent. I mean, at least if it's mortgage, then you could say part of it is going to equity. But even if it's mortgage, then you're locking up a lot of your money into your house, and that money maybe could do better if it's not locked up in your house and invested elsewhere. If you have a really high mortgage payment, then that reduces your cash balance. So you might run out of cash at the end of the month. And if you run out of cash, then you still need to eat, you still need to spend money on groceries. You might be tempted to put your groceries on a credit card, and if you can't pay back that credit card, well, then you're gonna start paying a 20% interest at least on that credit card, maybe even higher. So you got to mind your cash balance too. And if your mortgage expense is too high, then that could reduce your cash balance and you would have a bad time. Now, the next thing you could look into reducing is your car expense. Maybe you don't need 2 cars. Maybe you can only have 1 car. Or maybe you don't need that fancy new BMW or Mercedes. Or maybe you can just downgrade to a Honda Civic. Now, your friends might make fun of you. Your friends might laugh at you. But you got to think, is it really worth it for people to admire you such that you need to spend a lot of money just to maintain having a BMW or a Mercedes when in fact you can't afford it? The next thing is also groceries. Now, you can't really cut down your groceries to 0, obviously, because you need to eat and you need to feed a family, right? But you could consider where you're shopping. So as we mentioned earlier, maybe don't shop at the fancy Italian themed grocery store. Maybe shop at Costco, or maybe shop at the discount grocery chains. Find ways to save money on your groceries. And in my opinion, if you do all these things right, you might not have to reduce your luxury spending too. Maybe you can still keep spending some money on dining out, or spending some money having fun with family and friends. So maybe you can keep your Netflix and your Spotify subscription, right? You don't have to cancel those. But my point is that you should be looking for ways to generally decrease your expenses. So what you don't want to be doing is chasing after the so-called American dream, right? And by American dream, I mean that big house with a white picket fence, with that BMW or the Mercedes parked in the driveway. So if you actually become really financially stable or really financially abundant, you can go for those things when you can actually afford them. But the fact is that a lot of people, they try to chase after these things when they're not, in fact, financially ready to have all these things. So they take on a massive debt load just to buy a fancy car, and they're spending a ton of money just to maintain that fancy car. And same thing with the house. They spend a lot of money on a big house that they can't afford. So take me for an example. I grew up in a family of 5. So I have 2 parents and 2 younger siblings. And we grew up in a house that was about 1,400 square foot. So it was kind of small. Sometimes it was a bit cramped, but I didn't die. I wasn't deprived or anything. My family had a 2001 Acura for the longest time, until that car finally died after like 17 years. So we drove around that car for as long as we could, and we avoided upgrading. And when we upgraded, my dad just bought a Volkswagen Jetta. He didn't buy the next new fancy BMW or the next fancy car that most of my friends' families were getting. So the point is that, is there a way for you to reduce your expenses? And a lot of people, for their housing, for example, they just don't want to go through the hassle, right? They don't want to move. They don't even want to look at alternative options to potentially save money. So they're just happy with the way that they are, and they're happy spending 50, 60, 70% of their income just on housing expense. And if you want to do that, that's great. You won't take any hits in your lifestyle in terms of the house that you live in itself, but you might take a hit elsewhere, like being tied down to a 9-to-5 job, or not being able to retire early, things like that. So don't go chasing all these things that you can't afford, because you got to really think, can I actually afford this? Or am I just chasing this thing because I want this thing now as opposed to later? So if you took some delayed gratification, if you just took some hits now in terms of your lifestyle, if it really pays off for you in the future, then maybe it's worth it to take a little bit of delayed gratification now and enjoy your life a lot easier in the future. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. Be sure to hit the like button if you like this video, and consider subscribing. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'll leave the links down in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.